Well, today we'll start for those of you that are visiting with us, we're working our way through the minor prophets. And today we're going to start the first of 3 lessons on the book of Amos. Learn a little bit about that gentleman and the times that he was speaking for God and some things that were going on. And I think we'll learn as we kind of dive into this book over the next 3 weeks that there is some serious correlation between the time in Israel at roughly 755 BC and 2018 White House, Texas. I think we'll see that there is some very similar times, very similar circumstances that are going on when God calls Amos to speak on his behalf. What do we know about this book of Amos? Little 9-chapter book in the Old Testament, tucked away in these little small books that have real long names with a lot of consonants and not a lot of vowels in them. What do we know about this book? Not everybody at once. It was an interesting time for Israel, for Judah, and also for the surrounding regions in that area. What else do we know? Do we know anything about Amos himself? Is he mentioned a lot in the Bible, or is he scarcely mentioned here and there? It tells us when we start reading the book that Amos, he lived right around Jerusalem in this area of Tekoa. Okay? And I think we even have some geographical stuff here. He's from the village of Tekoa, 12 miles south of Jerusalem, 18 miles west of the Dead Sea, and 6 miles south of Bethlehem. So right around in Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Dead Sea area. And it's interesting that that's probably around 6 or so miles for where the kind of the border between Israel and Judah was. So just inside Judah from the border of Israel and Judah. And then Bethel, where this collection of speeches supposedly or may have or probably did take place, was only about probably 10 miles north of the Tekoa region where Amos was. But I think we'll find when we go through this book the next 3 weeks that God's patience had started to run out. And I love the way that the book starts. In verse 2 it says, "And the Lord roars from Zion." We know that God is patient, right? We know that He's long-suffering. All those characteristics that we love about God, He is. But then all of a sudden, when the Lord has enough, He roars like a lion. He sends a message to His people. And it's a serious message, and it's a message for us today, as same as it was in roughly the year 755 BC. But before we get going into all that, this is the 4th book that we've studied. We started with the book of Obadiah. You remember we talked about the fall of Eden? Put it on the map up there. We had a couple of lessons from Joel. When you think about Joel, it's hard to get away from the way that Joel describes the coming day of the Lord, right? Similar in message to what we're going to see here in Amos. And then we took a small 1-week study in Jonah. And what did Jonah teach us? It laid the foundation work that God does not only hold His people that He gives the law to accountable, He also holds, quote-unquote, outsiders, other regions outside the nation of Israel and Judah accountable, right? With Nineveh. What did He hold them accountable for? If you don't have the law given to you, then how are you supposed to act? How are these foreign nations judged? Based on what? When it all gets right down to it, they were judged primarily on their morality and their social justice. How did you treat other people? Did you treat people the way that it's instilled in a person to treat their neighbors? Or did you go outside of that and allow yourself to treat people like chattel and like property? Okay, God holds that very serious when He starts talking about how He views you as good or bad. And Jonah introduced us to that a little bit. And also Obadiah with the way the Edomites were treating their brothers and sisters. But the reason why I even say that is because when we take a study of Amos, we're primarily looking at two things. Okay? God's wrath on the regions based on two things. You either broke covenant with the law, if you were the nation of Israel or Judah, or you had great social injustice that was being judged by God even though you never had the law given to you. Okay? What do I mean by that? What do I mean by how can a nation that's never been given the law be held accountable for the way that they treat people and they treat their neighbors? How can God hold people accountable for that if they've never given them the law? Does any scriptures come to mind? Yes, sir.
So back in Romans, we said, Paul says, have declared the word of God confirmed your potential. So about the things that are made, we need to recognize God. And more attributes.
That's right. When God creates man, in whose image did He create him in? His, right? It doesn't take a Rhodes Scholar to figure out that the nature of man is to treat his brother with respect the way he wants to be treated, right? And when we allow other factors to get in the way of that, and we start taking money or wealth or power or you name it, and we start squashing people down so that we can make ourselves better, God gets irritated with that. And that's exactly what's happened at this time in Amos. And He's fixing to rain down the thunder on these nations for that. So when we start talking about Amos, the Bible tells us that he was a shepherd and a gatherer of sycamore fruit. And he was called by God to prophesy. It's Amos 7, 14 and 15. And we'll talk more about that in a couple of weeks. But it's also here in chapter 1, verse 1. He was among the sheep breeders of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, the king of Judah, and the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. Y'all find that interesting when you read that? All of a sudden, he's talking about the timeline when God called Amos to speak on his behalf. And there's a range when this could have happened, but generally if we say 755, 760 BC, that's going to put us pretty much right in that 50 or 60 year range, okay? Give or take, 755 BC. But then he says 2 years before the earthquake. I wonder what was the deal in this earthquake, that it was significant enough to be mentioned in Scripture in Amos. The only thing that we know about this earthquake is it must have been massive. Why do you say that? Because we have an obscure passage over in Zechariah chapter 14 where they talk about this same earthquake. So something happened about this earthquake that disrupted the whole region and caused people to actually move locations and shift where they lived. Big time things happened on this earthquake. So it's mentioned here as a point of reference and a point in time. Now we don't know anything more about that, except it was so significant, Zechariah chapter 14 talks about it. I thought that was just kind of interesting. So, what does the name mean? Amos. What does Amos mean? I can't even hardly say it. A bearer of burden. Interesting, right? We've talked about his home was the village of Tekoa. We've talked about where that was. It's right there, pretty close to that kind of dividing line between the northern kingdom Israel and the southern kingdom Judah. And then we said that he was a sheep breeder or a herder and a tender of sycamore fruit. Does anybody know anything about a tender of sycamore fruit? It's kind of interesting. It's a fruit that obviously grows on a tree, but it's really interesting. In order to get that fruit to sweeten up and become ripe, it has to be punctured. So this fruit has to be punctured with some sort of implement that allows it to become sweet and ripe and then able to be eaten. So it's not just like a guy that goes out and plucks grapes or digs potatoes. A lot of work that goes into this. 2 different times of going in and doing that. Why would he have 2 jobs? Any idea? What? It's seasonal, which is true. And it's actually even probably right, because this area of Tekoa where he tends these sheep, and I've kind of read a bunch, and I'm not really sure exactly what type of sheep are in that region. I've heard different kinds, and the more research I do, I think I'm ready to say I don't think anybody knows. But there's some kind of an ugly sheep that lives up there. But it's roughly 2,700 feet above sea level, and it's basically in a barren land in the summer, this island of Tekoa. Nothing grows up on the mountaintops on the summer. So they have to leave there, go down into the valley. There's his seasonal job when he moves his sheep around, and then takes on the other second job. One thing that we can kind of figure out about Amos is he was a man that toiled and labored hard every day. He was a hard worker. He was a tough guy. Now, there are some people who write extensively about what this means to be a sheep breeder at this specific time in the Bible, and they want to kind of lead you in an area that says maybe he owned a big operation and was growing sheep by the thousands or hundreds of thousands in order to supply the religious needs of the nations for their sacrificial system. I personally don't think that that's probably accurate, but I don't have any facts to say it's not. To me, this was a very hard time for God. He needed a strong man with a strong message for a very poignant group of people, and he picked a man that could deliver that message for him. This was a tough man. This was a strong man, and it was a man who was able to answer the call of God and walk straight into Bethel at the high priest's face and call out the nation and call out the king and say, this is all coming to an end. This is serious business. So if we move forward, under his character, he's not known for his sympathy and warmth. If you read through the book of Amos, there's not a lot of love talk in here. It's a lot of stern talk about this is how you've upset God and this is why God is going to destroy you. He was a tough man. Haley says this, not a sob is to be found in his book for the nation of wicked apostates, and there is only a sigh for the poor. When we talk about the date, we've said 755. We know that it's he prophesied in the days of Uzziah the king in Judah and Jeroboam the second of Israel. That's how we can pretty much date when this book was generally written. And when we talk about 2 years before the earthquake, we've talked about the reference in Zechariah 14:5, but also the ancient Jewish historian Josephus talks extensively about this earthquake in a collection of facts he calls the Antiquities. And you can find that, and I have some of those if you care to dig that deep into it. I have some of those references too. So it's not only just in the Bible history record, but also the history record of the Jewish people. Who's his audience here? The audience of this book is primarily the northern kingdom in Israel. The conditions which characterize Israel at this time were what? What do we know about 755 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel, and you can probably say the southern kingdom in Judah pretty much too. What was the characteristics? What does the Bible lead us to believe here in Amos that was going on in that period of time? Were they experiencing tough times or a time of prosperity? Prosperity. Prosperity pretty much beyond any belief. Okay? I thought it was really interesting of what the Bible here in Amos describes about the wealthy people of the time. When you think about people that have wealth in 2018 in White House, Texas, when you say that guy or that woman is wealthy, what do we associate that with? What do they have? They got material stuff, right? Yes, sir? Oh, yeah, brand name stuff. Nice shoes, shiny shoes. What else? Maybe they got jewelry. Maybe they got a big house. Hey, maybe they got 2 houses. Maybe they have a beach house. Maybe they have a mountain house. Maybe they have this house. Well, guess what? Let's look at a couple things together the way the Bible describes the wealthy in Amos. Look at chapter 3, verse 15. That in the day I punish Israel for their transgression, I will also visit destruction on the altars of Bethel, and the horns of the altar shall be cut off and fall to the ground. Listen to this, verse 15. I will destroy the winter house along with the summer house. The houses of ivory shall perish, and the great houses shall have an end. Materialism. Turn over to chapter 6. Verses 3 through 6. Woe to you who put far off the day of doom, who cause the seat of violence to come near, who lie on beds of ivory, stretch out on your couches, eat lambs from the flock and calves from the midst of the stall, who sing idly to the sound of string instruments and invent for yourselves musical instruments like David, who drink wine from bowls and anoint yourselves with the best ointments, but are not grieved for the affliction of Joseph. Right? Good times for the nation. Prosperity beyond all belief. Multiple homes for people. Life is good. They're getting lazy. They're just laying back and they're drinking a lot. What does that cause? What does that kind of lifestyle cause? Does that cause one to get closer to God, or does that generally cause one to get farther away from God and more self-sufficient? Yes, sir?
In 5, there it points out that they were doing these things for themselves. So it was all self-seeking.
You know, when times are good, sometimes our prayer life maybe falls off a little bit, doesn't it? Because we're not dependent on God when times are good. We're dependent on us. We control our own destiny. We make the decisions that's best for us. But then what happens when you get knocked down? Right? We turn back to God. That's exactly what's happened here in Israel. and we'll talk more about it over the next 2 weeks. These are religious people. The problem is they've fallen out of love with the law. Have you ever thought about that? Can you be a religious person and really not love the Bible? See, they were going through the motions. They were going through the sacrificial system. They were going and presenting their sacrifices the way they were supposed to. But it was all for show. It was just for them. They didn't care anything about God and the covenant with God. And it came and showed by the way that they were treating the poor. And it goes on to say that they were trading people and people that were below them like silver. And they were trading people for shoes. They didn't care about people. They cared about themselves and making themselves look better. And they were going through the motions. And their wives were part of this too. This wasn't just the men. The wives were sitting back. And the Bible talks about all they want to do is sit around and drink and talk about cool things. But they weren't in love with the law. They had taken it for granted. And God got so sick of it that that's why He called Amos to come and announce the destruction of Israel and Judah and every one of the regions around them. If you have, some of your Bibles have some maps in them. And I was looking through mine this morning. And I have a map in mine called the Kingdom Years. I don't know if y'all have something like that, but it's way back here about 700-800 BC. And it talks about, it shows you where Judah was, where Israel was, where Syria, Phoenicia, Philistia, everybody on this entire map in my Bible is talked about in the first 2 chapters of Amos, and their doom and destruction is listed by name. Everybody on this page fell into exactly what's going on in Amos, and they're all called out. And you say, well, man, Brody, that's a lot of people. That's a lot of geography. That's how mad God was. He cannot stand when we treat people like we don't want to be treated ourselves. Don't forget, God is sympathetic to slavery, correct? You remember there was a group that was taken up in slavery that He took under His wing and brought them out to be His people. And those very people are now treating people the way they were treated under the Egyptian rule. And I'm sure the Lord is scratching His head going, I cannot believe these people have turned from me. And they won't come back. And I just wonder, at 2018 in White House, Texas, if we don't fall into this exact same boat. You got to admit, by the world standards, we're pretty wealthy people, aren't we? We've got a watch. We've got pretty new clothing here. We have a shelter over our head. Most of us got here with a vehicle to drive. Are we just playing religion? Or are we Christians? Are we going through the motions? Or are we really Christians? And it's really something that everybody needs to ask themselves, because this is an individual thing that has been promoted to a corporate thing. Do we treat people right? Do we treat people the way God expects us to treat our neighbors? Now, it's one thing to make money or materials or food or clothing available to the needy. That's one thing. But I would ask you this. I think it goes one step farther. Do you see people that are in need of the Word of God, and we walk right by them and never say a word. Because you know what that tells God? You don't love that person, you actually hate them. Because you have the gift of life for them, and you walk right by them and don't think anything of them, and you'll sit there and let them die. Becoming a Christian has responsibilities, and that is to share the gospel with those that need it. And when we stop doing that, we're no different than these people right here. There's a lot of parallels between 755 Israel and 2018 White House, Texas. I'm getting way behind, so let's move forward here a little bit. Let's look at these different folks here. Halfway through the second page. The oracles of sin and judgment upon the nations. So the first nation that's brought in is in verses 3 through 5. It's Damascus. We know that's in Syria. The Bible talks about the cruelty toward the inhabitants of Gilead, and that's specifically the tribes of Gad and Reuben. God says you're going to have utter destruction, and you're going to have captivity, and we know that that was fulfilled by the Assyrians in 2 Kings chapter 16, 1 through 9. Then Amos goes right into Gaza, which is Gaza's left. Gaza is west of Jerusalem, okay, in the region of Philistia. And their sin is engaging specifically in slave traffic, which God hates. Their judgment is total devastation, and it was fulfilled by the Assyrians. Look at Tyre. Tyre is a little bit northwest, kind of the northern parts of the kingdom of Israel. Their sin is slave traffic. And they did not remember the brotherhood between Solomon and Hiram. And that confused me. I had to go back and read that. What happened between Solomon and Hiram? There was a treaty that was struck in 1 Kings 5:12. A treaty between Solomon and Hiram to basically play nice in a sandbox. Well, they broke that treaty. And breaking treaties is bad news. Breaking covenant is bad news. And so what did God say? He says total devastation and destruction. And we know that the fulfillment started in Nebuchadnezzar and was finished in Alexander the Great. And then letter D, we get to Edom. Now we're pretty familiar with Edom because we spent a whole class talking about that, right, in the book of Obadiah. Their sin was cruelty to the brethren. You remember what that cruelty was? Remember when Judah was invaded and the tribes of Judah were trying to go through the land of Edom to escape all of the armies that were coming down? You remember what they did? They stood in the gap and they made them turn around and go back and be killed. And then also when their land was getting invaded, guess who swooped up from the bottom? The Edomites swooped up from the bottom and stole from them during the war. So it was cruelty to the brethren was a sin, and the judgment was the destruction of their capital, another big city. And then we know that the fulfillment came in 400 BC by the Nabetans, who were from the east side of Edom. Remember, they had to come in from under Edom from the right-hand side, and they took them over. Now remember, that's 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 4 regions of people. That's 4 countries here, basically. 4 nations. And this is to the people, this is the northern kingdom that's hearing this. Do you think they're cheering this on? These are their enemies. And Amos is sitting here saying, they're going down, and they're going down, and they're going down. And I can almost hear the leaders of the nation of Israel getting excited about this. You see, God's taking care of us like He always said He would. And then here we go, Ammon. Ammon. Same thing. Look at their sin. The murder of pregnant women in Gilead, of the tribes of Gad and Reuben. Why did they murder these pregnant women? For one reason and one reason only. They wanted their land. That's it. That's a rough people, right? And here I can almost hear the nation of Israel. Yeah! Get them! And then Moab, the same thing. They did an interesting thing. They burned the king of Edom's bones to lime. I guess that's a bad thing. God says that's a bad thing. Must be a bad thing. I don't quite get it, but I believe it's true. The judgment was to be the total destruction of the chief city of Corinth. And it happened by the Babylons. And all of a sudden, everybody's real excited. God is coming to take us home. God is coming to take care of us. And then Amos delivers a little thread on Judah. In chapter 2, verses 4 and 5, all of a sudden Amos says, "For 3 transgressions of Judah and for 4, I will not turn away its punishment, because they have despised the law of the Lord and have not kept His commandments." Now that's different than everything else, right? All these other folks who didn't have the law were treating people badly, were into slave trafficking, were committing heinous crimes, and all of a sudden just a couple of verses here, 2 for Judah, and all he has to say is, "You haven't kept my commandments." And I'm sure that the crowd started to get a little quiet. And then the shoe fell. And it fell starting in verse 6 through 16. 10 verses. Amos spends absolutely putting the hammer down on Israel. Look at what he says. Verse 7. Well, let's go back to verse 6. "For 3 transgressions of Israel and for 4 I will not turn away its punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver and they sell the poor for a pair of sandals. They pan after the dust of the earth, which is on the head of the poor, and pervert the way of the humble. A man and his father go into the same girl to defile my holy name." Tends to believe that prostitution is rampant. "They lie down by every altar on clothes taken in pledge, and drink the wine of the condemned in the house of their God." You see, they're religious people, but they don't love the law. And if you don't love the law, what do you succumb to? You succumb to whatever the religion of the day is. So all of a sudden, whichever God shows up, whoever brings a new God, they're interested in that. And they'll go to their altar of some foreign God and pay their respects. Just like they do the God that took them out of Egypt. They're religious, but they don't love the law. He says, "Yet it was I who destroyed the Amorite before them," and he talks about how he brought them out of Egypt. Look at verse 12. This really makes the Lord mad here. Start with verse 11. "I raised up some of your sons as prophets, and some of your young men as Nazarites. Is it not so, O children of Israel, says the Lord? But you gave the Nazarites wine to drink, and commanded the prophets, saying, do not prophesy." Those special young men, those that took the Nazarite vow, what did the Nazarite vow include? Abstaining from alcohol and some other things. Hair. They made them drink, encouraged them to drink wine and take that vow and throw it in the trash. And the prophets. They commanded, we don't like what you're saying, so don't say that around here. And it's real interesting because, as we'll learn in 2 weeks from now, they tried to shut Amos up too. All of a sudden, all the cheering comes real close to the nation of Israel when Amos takes 10 verses to explain how they are going to be destroyed. Now, what's their sin again? All of this stuff, social injustice, slave trade and abuse of the poor, immorality, idolatry, rebellion against God. Does that sound like 2018 in the United States? This is a wake-up call for us. That's why God chose to reserve this and write it in this Bible so we can read it. It's a wake-up call to anybody that has some prosperity. And it's true then and it's true now. So, there's 3 lessons for these first 2 chapters. There's 3 lessons that I'd like for us to take home from Amos. Number 1, God holds the nations of men accountable. Is there anybody that questions the fact that God will hold you accountable for what you do and don't do? He holds nations accountable that don't even have the law. He holds the nation of Israel and Judah accountable who did have the law. And He will definitely hold us accountable who now have the full Bible in our lap, that live in this age. He's going to hold us accountable. Number 2, apostasy and cruelty are treated alike. God condemned the heathens for their cruelty, Judah and Israel for their apostasy. But both of their judgments were the same. Now, how is that? How can He hold apostasy and cruelty the same? That's not fair, is it? God is all about what? Justice and mercy. And we need to understand that. Apostasy and cruelty are the same in the eyes of God. Because you know what they both are? They're both sin. And He'll hold us accountable. And number 3, the standards to which the nations were held accountable. The heathen were judged for their violation of basic principles of righteousness, and the people of God were judged by their faithfulness to God's revealed Word. We'll end. We've got about 2 minutes. If someone has Romans chapter 2, see if I can get you to read it for us. Romans chapter 2, verses 12 through 15. And while somebody's flipping over to that, I want to remember this. The people of God were judged by their faithfulness to God's revealed Word. That's us, right? So now come over to the New Testament. What does Romans 2, 12 through 15 say? Anybody?
For as many as have sinned without the law will also perish without the law. And as many as have sinned in the law will be judged by the law. For not the hearers of the law are just in the sight of God, but the doers of the law will be justified. For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts, accusing or else accusing them. In the day when God will judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ, according to my gospel.
It's kind of a tongue twister. Thank you for reading that. Underline that in your Bible. 12 through 15 states that we as Christians, living in the Christian dispensation, have full visibility to the plan of God. And that plan of God will be exactly what we're judged by. Now, what does that plan of God say for us? One, that we're baptized believers for the forgiveness of sin. But now move forward to that. What does it say? It says that we are to live our lives in a way that makes God proud of us, and to take as many people who are outside of that relationship into that relationship with us so that they can go to heaven when they die. If we don't do that, we will be held accountable. Yes, sir.
The timeless lesson, greater privilege brings greater responsibility.
Absolutely, right? And we are living in the time of privilege. Thank y'all for coming this morning. Oh, one more. Hold on. 2 verses.
Romans 12:14 says that we will all give an account of ourselves.
Right.
And John 12:38 points out that we will all be judged by the words of Jesus.
That's exactly right. We will be judged by the words that Jesus spoke. Thank y'all for coming. Welcome to our visitors. Everybody introduce yourself to the visitors you see around, and we will go with part 2 of Amos next week. Thank you.